Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Switchfoot titled Fading West. Now the worst thing you could ever say about any rock band is that they're boring. Now I'm being serious. Think about it in a larger historical context. There have been plenty of bad rock bands throughout the years, especially when any certain large movements of rock have gotten any sort of prominence in the mainstream. There have been bad hair metal bands, there have been bad grunge bands, then there have been a lot of bad post-grunge bands. But there's a place in conversation about the aggressively bad rock bands because they're at least interesting to talk about, even if it is just to viciously slag them over and over again. The name remains embedded in the cultural conversation, and 10 years later, when we're talking about bad bands, we'll remember them for being awful. As much as so many people like to hate upon Nickelback and Linkin Park, and let's face it, both the bands can deserve it, all the hatred that they've received hasn't exactly stopped them from making music, and it won't wipe them from the history books when musical scholars have the misfortune to examine that first decade of the 21st century. But if you call a rock band boring, it's so much worse, because they might not be bad per se, but being acceptable or passable often translates in a few years outside of a hardcore fan base into forgettable. And really, the more I look back into the post-grunge scene in the late 90s and early 2000s, the more I see bands in this vein just completely disappearing from the cultural memory, maybe within a few more years. If you want your music to last, I can't think of a worse fate. And now, on that note, we come to Switchfoot, which for me has been one of the most strikingly anonymous rock bands to which I've ever listened. Mostly because they sound very much like the watered-down version of whatever style of music was popular at the time. Of course, that didn't exactly surprise me, given that they started in the Christian rock scene in the late 90s. So something that built their entire appeal off of mimicking mainstream music and with a Christian underturn. And they haven't exactly left the Christian rock elements behind. And while Switchfoot has fortunately never had an evangelical bent, those first 5 albums, they felt very neutered and they lacked a certain edge to them, especially in comparison with their contemporaries like the Foo Fighters or Queens of the Stone Age. They were inoffensive, lightweight rock and roll that didn't take any chances. And considering that they were cribbing so much from other bands, first in case of mainstream post-grunge, then a very, very poor man's Queens of the Stone Age, and then moving on to some of the lighter adult alternative throughout the mid-2000s. Now, let me stress this, they were never as bad as Skillet or Creed, but neither were they anything close to being worth recommending, at least from my point of view. But then again, around their album Oh Gravity, someone apparently told the band that a shift to a more serious, rougher, hard-edged sound might work better for them. On the one hand, the guitars got harsher and more ragged and started reminding me more of the Foo Fighters minus the memorable riffs, but on the other hand, the tone got darker and that made the band a whole lot less tolerable. And it was a number of factors that contributed to this particular change. John Foreman isn't remotely convincing as a heavier, more aggressive singer, the lyrics still weren't much to write home about, and there was an awkward defensiveness in some of those records that really got on my nerves. Despite the fact that Switchfoot never really went evangelical, their lack of real humor or wit began to make some of their preachier songs a lot less tolerable. So look, I wasn't exactly enthused when I geared myself up to listen to Fading West. I mean, after so many albums of lightweight and not particularly memorable Christian rock, did Fading West manage to surprise me at all? Well, yeah, it did, but not in a good way. Somehow, Switchfoot did something I wasn't expecting. They made their most sterile, lightweight, and hopelessly generic album to date, which is somehow even more anonymous and devoid of personality than their previous works. It's not even grating or obnoxious in the way that some previous bad Switchfoot albums have been. It's just the sort of music that inspired only one immediate response from me. Well, that was sound coming through my speakers. Can I listen to something else now? Okay, so that's admittedly a very harsh thing to say, and I bet some of the fans are already screaming bloody murder in the comments, so let me try to explain this. And let's start with the instrumentation, where, once again, Switchfoot has decided, instead of crafting a distinctive instrumental identity for themselves, they'd emulate one that's already popular. In this case, the percussion-heavy, reverb and distortion-saturated, choral-overloaded modern rock sound favored by acts like Imagine Dragons. And in theory, this isn't a bad idea. Lending a lightweight act like Switchfoot some gravitas or presence, well, that's not a bad choice. And you can tell that they're really trying to make the band sound bigger and more important. It reminded me a lot of some of the production work that was done in 30 Seconds to Mars' third album, This Is War. And frankly, it's just about as ineffectual as that mess was. The issue here is a common one to Switchfoot, and one that's more prevalent than ever in modern rock, which is really not a good sign. A lack of a solid, interesting melody line that's driven by guitars that doesn't feel hopelessly overused. I will admit that the band does manage to get some solid momentum on the closing track, Back to the Beginning Again, and there's an interesting guitar tone choice on BA55, which I'm guessing is supposed to spell out bass. But outside of that, it's a pop rock sound that wouldn't sound out of place on a modern Backstreet Boys or One Direction album, and yet somehow less memorable than that sounds. And then we've got the vocals, and look, while I'm happy to see John Foreman move away from trying to sound tough and towards a more melodic direction, I can't say that after 8 albums I'm entirely impressed with him. He reminds me a fair bit of Daughtry in that he has energy and exuberance and a lot of earnestness, but not a lot of emotional range, and that does kind of get to me. And while he does work well with the backing chorals behind them, the occasional bits of auto-tune on his vocals feel like they were just added in order to make this record sound more processed and electronic and generic, and that's not a good sign. Now granted, none of this is helped by the lyrics, which might be some of the most thin and interchangeable lyrics I've ever heard. Now, I'll come out and say this, that Switchfoot have never been great songwriters outside of some basic technical proficiency and occasionally interesting metaphors, but they used to try a lot harder than this. A selection of generational, inspirational tripe that I feel that I've heard time and time again from dozens of artists, even so far in the past year. I made the 30 Seconds to Mars comparison earlier, and you know what, it feels relevant here because Switchfoot is trying to inspire passion and energy in their audience, but I have no clear feel of the stakes or that there's any real detail in the struggles that Switchfoot is trying to describe. They talk about lost generations and rising up and love alone is worth the fight, and it's all so basic. And sure, such arch concepts can be powerful with the right sort of delivery, but Switchfoot just doesn't have the power or flair to make them stand out. Now, for an example, let's take the song Say It Like You Mean It, where they feel like they've lost their ability to inspire the audience, and they want us to speak up and do something, show some degree of response. Not just say it, but do or say what? Like, it's not rooted in anything, so the uplifting, quasi-inspiring lyrics, they just feel weightless and they don't really have any impact with me. Now, some might say that all this is rooted in Switchfoot's faith and that we should all realize that they're talking about God here. But here's the thing, Switchfoot aren't exactly subtle songwriters, and they make it pretty evident that when they're talking about the guy upstairs in their music. And to that end, this is probably their least nominally religious album to date, at least when it comes to the lyrics. And you know what, most of the time that wouldn't be a bad thing, but here it strips away some of the personality that at least made some of the Switchfoot songs memorable in a certain way, being Christian rock that was more, had a lighter tone and wasn't aggressively evangelical. Take the songs like Bass and The World You Want seem at first to be referring to God, but in the latter song, the you in question appears to be referring to some sort of girl, and then the bridge references all manner of things like what you say, how you say, who you love, how you love, all your science, all your hatred, all your wars, all of them are your religion. Now, okay, this is a pretty simple metaphor showing how all these things are incredibly important to the girls in question's life, but I gotta be honest, it's a really sloppy and really broad metaphor. It has no punch for me, and it still feels maddeningly unspecific with lines like, every day you're alive, you change the world. Now, on a very basic level, that's just above affirming that breathing means you're alive and you're changing something, which is very much along the lines of a later track on this album titled Let It Out, which is a song about exhaling one's fear and insecurities away and apparently becoming better. Yeah, that's the level of metaphor and songwriting we're working with here. Look, the issue here isn't the intent, but the execution, where these lyrics are so basic and broad and bland, and the instrumentation is so recycled and devoid of interesting melodies. There's no dramatic force behind the music here for me. After 8 albums, I understand Switchfoot's appeal. The unthreatening, lighter version of modern rock that's passable for a Christian audience and just well produced enough to avoid the Christian rock stigma. But on that standard, I didn't expect to be moved or impressed going in. I did not expect that. But you know what? At least previous Switchfoot albums got me to feel something. With Fading West, I just don't feel much of anything at all, because this album just had no impact or resonance with me whatsoever. It wasn't particularly good, but you know what? It wasn't objectively bad either. By my standards of Switchfoot, I didn't like it as much as Hello Hurricane or Oh Gravity, because at least they had some guitar-driven edge, and at least they felt like they were trying harder than this. But you know what? This isn't Switchfoot's worst album either. So you know what? I'm going to give this album a 5 out of 10, and I'm only going to recommend it if you're a big fan of Switchfoot, but even then, it's not their best. Everyone else, look guys, it might be in the doldrums of January, but you know what? That most recent album of Queens of the Stone Age, Like Clockwork, it still exists, and I'm sure Dave Grohl's got something coming this year. 2014 just started, and I wouldn't have reviewed this if you guys hadn't asked me to, but right now it's bound to get better soon. I gotta hope so. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know some of you are probably pretty angry, but hey, I only say what I feel. I wish this album could have had impact with me, but it just did nothing with me. Went in one ear, right out the other. If there's anything else you'd like me to cover throughout the course of this year, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to hear it. Until then, see you next time.